We'll just get started. Hello, welcome to React Orlando June edition. That's a really terrible name for what we're doing here, but I tried. Okay, so we usually like to start off just by thanking the folks that helped make this possible. The first group that we like to point out is Joe and Big Vision. Joe's actually sneaking back here. This is Joe's space and Joe's agency, and we get to kind of share the space with them. And are you guys hiring? Can we plug that or anything? Or?
No dev openings.
No dev openings. Okay, but Big Vision's a neat company, neat space, and yeah, we always want to thank them for hosting us. So yeah, that's that. Do you want to say anything to everybody? I guess you're not hiring, so you're like. Yeah. That's it.
No special announcements.
Fair enough. Okay, cool. Our next sponsor is John over here from Tech Systems, right?
Yes.
Yep. Do you want to say anything about what you're doing? Stand up and say about positions that are open.
Yeah.
So John picks up the food, the Chick-fil-A, the beer, and we're really appreciative of that. So go ahead.
All right. So yeah, a lot of familiar faces, but for those of you first time, my name is John. I work with Tech Systems, largest IT services staffing firm in the nation. My job simply, build, maintain relationships with the top web developers in the Orlando area. Tech Systems, we work with the top companies in the Orlando area: Disney, Universal, all the hotels, Wyndham, Hilton, Marriott. I'm not sure if anyone saw. I did do a quick, short little posting in the React Meetup page. React's definitely growing. We're seeing a lot of openings now with several companies. One, for instance, Web Benefits. They're looking for a web developer to work on their core IT initiative built out in React Redux. We've got companies out in Melbourne for those who are open to commuting. I was talking to Lewis earlier, told him that one of my account managers actually said that Disney's even putting together a team that's coming down the pipeline. So, I mean,
really?
Yeah.
Angular.
Yeah, which I was saying to him, pretty crazy. As he knows, Universal Studios and Disney, everything as far as their front end built out in Angular. So,
making the switch.
Yeah.
Joining the light side.
There you go. So, yeah, I mean, if any of you have any questions, I'll be here afterwards. And yeah.
All right. Thanks, John. Thanks. All right, cool. So for tonight, do you want to give your own introduction? Yeah? No. I'll. Because you're going to be too modest. It's not going to be. So for tonight, for our talk, you guys saw on the React Orlando meetup, we're going to talk about how to open source a React library. And our speaker, Andrew, is really awesome. I've actually known you for a couple of years now. We met at Orlando JS meetup, and he used to work at Partners. I think some of his colleagues are here. And now he works for TrueCar, which is a company out west, doing React Dev for them. He also does some stuff on TopTal. Dude's a beast. Does a lot of work. Really smart guy. Looking forward to the talk. He's also might talk about the React Context API. So, yeah, without further ado.
Thanks. We are streaming today, so if you're watching the stream, sorry, it's not like super professional or anything, but we are going on the theory that something is better than nothing. We're definitely testing that premise, so see how that goes. Yeah, thanks for coming out. So as far as open sourcing a React library goes, I know at least one person in here has done this. Gabe has a pretty substantial library that he's built, which is pretty cool. It's kind of a bunch of stuff on GitHub. Like, it's mostly apps that have a couple little libraries that no one uses, including me. So I'm not, I'm not really what I would consider an expert on like open source or open sourcing things. But that being said, I think that kind of goes along with the talk in that you don't have to be that to have an open source library that other people can use, or that you can just have out there for your own use if you need it. And most of those people that we kind of think of as like open source gods started out just sort of like putting stuff out there, and something kind of caught on with the community. So Yeah, so that's kind of the preface. So open sourcing a library, kind of got the initial idea for this talk at React Rally last year. To be honest with you guys, some of the talks I do at React Orlando are like not anything I ever had an idea for. It's just like, we don't have a speaker this month. What's interesting that people want to know about? Like, let's talk about it. So, but this is something that I had been thinking about because at React Rally, there were 2 talks that talked about open source. Max Stoiber, I don't know if anyone knows how to pronounce his name, the guy who made Style Components, if you're familiar with that. He did a talk about open source that was really compelling, just about sort of like the motivation behind why you would want to do open source and contribute to the community. And Henry, don't even remember his last name, the primary author of Babel, he did a similar
Henry
Zhu, thank you. Yeah, he also did a talk kind of about the principles of open source. And so I think I'd like to think a lot of people kind of get the concept of open source, but the technical aspects can be a little bit of a challenge. I know it was for me. And there's really not that much to it, which I guess is a good segue. This talk is probably pretty short, and if it's real short, I'm also going to do a little thing about the context API, which is pretty new and pretty interesting. So that's kind of more, possibly like a more practical application for your apps that we can talk about real quick too. So we'll see how that goes, whether we get to it or not. So as far as open sourcing a library goes, like if you're not 100% sure what that is or why you want to do it, React is an open source library. A lot of the tools you use with React, like Redux, React Router, those are all open source libraries, right? The code is hosted on GitHub. You can install it through NPM, which is a JavaScript package manager. Yeah, so those are open source libraries. But there's a lot of smaller ones, like Lodash is one that we probably all use. But there's also kind of like really like single use case libraries out there that you can, if you find yourself in some weird edge case and you don't want to write code, you can just npm install and it fixes your problem, right? Hopefully it doesn't steal all your secrets and stuff. So that's kind of what open source is. And the thing that's beneficial, sort of like in a very selfish way about doing open source as an app developer, is that once you generalize a solution to a problem, you can reuse it. And you don't end up recreating the same solution in like slightly different ways 100 times. So I know I've done this, like you have an app and you need to do X. You need to like, I don't know what you need to do. Something you have to do in an app all the time, right? Like whatever that kind of thing is. You need a thing to close when you click outside of it, right? So you figure out a way to do it with this like you make this one thing you need it to close when you click outside of it. So you figure out how to do that for the one thing. And then there's another thing, you know, your designer like throws you new design. It's like, oh, there's another thing I have to do that for it. So you either copy paste it or you like pull it out into an abstraction that's like just abstract enough to work for those 2 cases. And then you have to do that again. And then that same case comes up in a separate app and you just redo it, right? And it's like a little bit different. So the idea with, if you open source something, you want to generalize it enough so anyone can use it and you can kind of think about that problem in a more like high level way. Like, okay, so if I had almost any thing that I needed to click outside of and I wanted it to close, how would I do that? And now you have a solution that you can use in all your apps instead of one at a time, copy pasting and trying to figure the same thing out over and over. And then the great thing about open source is that in a less selfish way, I might come along, have the same problem, be able to use your solution as well. So whether you actually want to do that on Click Outside is a whole other question about like accessibility and stuff. Probably not a great example, but you get the idea. Yeah, so this slide, generalize your problem and solution. One thing I'm occasionally guilty of is like abstracting too early. So, you know, that's not always great because you end up with the wrong abstraction, right? Now, if you go to the trouble of like open sourcing it, now you So, and then another thing is, even though you are generalizing and making it open to the public, it doesn't have to be perfect. Like no one, you know, the likelihood is that no one's going to see it anyway. So like, don't worry about the code being too perfect, and don't worry about covering every edge case that doesn't necessarily fit into what you need it for, right? So like on click outside, you know, like you might be able to think of some crazy weird scenario that doesn't apply to your app. Like don't necessarily spend a bunch of time solving everyone else's problems before you even really figured out how to solve your own. So what's up?
Oh, I was just gonna say, like, what if I wanted to click outside the browser?
Right, exactly, yeah, yeah. Or on a different monitor, right? Yeah, then what happens? Totally. So yeah, don't think about that. That's what I'm saying.
Do you have
Okay.
any tips for like avoiding trying to
Just don't, you know.
What's
I guess like how do you know when?
Well, okay, so avoiding abstracting too early. Like you probably abstracted too early if you abstracted before you even solved the problem and shipped it, right? So like, yeah, if you have one problem that you're solving and you're like, I could totally see this being a problem in 50 different places. Like I should make this cool thing that'll fix that.
Well, like,
You should probably like at least fix it for the one thing and make sure it works and does what you intended in the first place.
well, one thing I was always doing was having like multiple. If I had like multiple sites I was working on, I'd always like have this little folder that I would copy paste from every single project. And every time I modified it a little bit, I'd like break the other project because I'd copy paste it and want to bring new features over from one site to another. So eventually, what I did was I just started using NPM words, and so basically I just made like some random like as you know sort of org on NPM, which is the @ symbol, then your org and slash whatever. And then so what I did was I started abstracting code that I was just using on more than one of the same type of project. So, you know, if I had Firebase in a site, I'd make little abstractions. And then what I do is, like if you're a really power user, you can make like an env file in your project, bring that in with .env, and then essentially, you know, your library will log into your database for you, and then, you know, just allow you to import it already initialized, and then you just say, oh, hey, I want this database set up, and it's already done. And it just use it across every site, and it doesn't have to work for everything. It just kind of helps you do it more than once easily. And
right.
You just kind of put it in the mono repo and call it that.
Yeah, yeah. You can just yarn it or npm install it. You don't have to copy paste it, rewrite it. Right. So I think I kind of covered this, but so once you have settled on a solution, extract it and generalize it so that it could be used by you in another app or by someone else in their app or whatever. So this is where we start getting into some of the more technical aspects of open sourcing, and specific to React, you end up needing to do secure dependencies. And so this is the part that to me wasn't straightforward, and why I thought it was worth doing a talk on, because I kind of ended up like just looking around on GitHub and seeing how library authors had configured their build processes and their like package JSONs, their dependency trees, and I didn't find any like straightforward resources on how to do that. So hopefully this will take some of the mystery out of that. Hopefully. A little bit more on the sort of more principle side of things, write some documentation, at least enough so that I know what it does, right? And like how to use it, you know, like what do I import at the top level, or is there like some, you know, named export that I need to import, you know, what are the methods I can call, whatever, like some basic stuff. If it's a React component, what are the props it accepts, what do they do? You know, I think we create barriers for ourselves for doing stuff like this that are really high. So like, don't necessarily do that, but do at least write enough so that I could understand what I'm looking at if I looked at your README. Okay, so preparing the app preparing the library for distribution. Specifically with React, if you have a React component, React and React DOM should not be dependencies of your library. Because React and React DOM, if they have conflicting versions, will just like crash. Your apps won't work. They don't. React doesn't like to be imported from more than one source in a project, nor does React DOM. I think React DOM is even worse for that. And then another example of things you would want to be pure dependencies was like if you made a Redux library, then you would want Redux and React Redux also to be pure dependencies, because those are things that an app that depends on your library should have in place already, right? Like if it's a Redux middleware, it's not going to work if Redux isn't already a dependency of the project. So it doesn't need to also be a dependency of your project, but it is. So they call those pure dependencies, which means it has to be, so a pure dependency has to be a dependency of the project that's using your library, but it isn't imported by your library directly. It just has to be there some other way, usually in the dependencies of the app that is depending on your library. Yeah, so, right, so in the slide here, I put that Lodash is usually an example of a dependency that wouldn't be a pure dependency because you use that generally in ways that you don't know, like if the consuming app of your library has Lodash or not, right? You just need these little helper functions. And so you would have those be a direct dependency of your library. And with Lodash, it's not a problem for you to have one version and some, the app to have another. It could be a bundle size issue, but that's not your problem as a library author necessarily. Something you want to think about, but not going to be an issue that's going to cause the app to not work or anything like that.
Do you usually put like in the documentation, you put like what is already expected to be in the project?
Yeah, usually there's a note about pure dependencies in a README, and also as an app author with dependencies, you can look at the package JSON of your dependency, and the pure dependencies are spelled out there. It's a separate group of dependencies in the apps or in the library's package JSON. Oh yeah, yep, you'll get warnings too. That's true. Yep, good point. Yeah, when you. Well, yeah, you tend to get them, right? Because if you have a library that's not being updated and it's like, oh, pure dependency React 13 to 14, and you're on React 16, it may very well work, but if they haven't updated it since React 14, you're going to get that pure dependency warning. But that's what that's about. That means that you have React libraries in your app that when they were written, when they were last updated, were depending on those versions of React. So they could very well break or give you deprecation warnings, right? Like if they had, like React is now deprecating certain lifecycle methods and stuff, so that could eventually break your app if you avoid, if you ignore those pure dependency warnings for too long, which most of us probably do. Okay, so so when you bundle up your library, as far as I can tell, the best way to export it is with universal module definition, which will basically allow it to be required Node style or CommonJS. ES6 style imports will work, and a traditional named global will also work, as in var React. Would if you aren't using any sort of bundler or import system. For production apps, most of us don't do that anymore, but it's nice for that to work just for like some code sandboxes and sort of playing around with stuff, right? So UMD is the abbreviation for that, Universal Module Definition. I have a link to a write-up about what UMD is, because I don't think I explained it very well, but basically it makes it work when other people try to use it in their apps. So there are different tools for library bundling. If you're React developers, you're probably all familiar with Webpack. That's generally what we use to bundle up our apps. As far as I can tell, most of the cool kids are using Rollup for their libraries these days. Rollup is more like geared toward library bundling than Webpack, because it's all about putting it into like one export as opposed to Webpack, which has so many options, different ways you can do things, multiple chunks, bundles, entry points, that sort of thing. Micro bundle is, I don't really know too much about it, but the guy who wrote Preact created micro bundle, and it looks like it's an alternative to Rollup. pretty low config way to, if you have a library, to bundle it up and make it work like as an NPM module. Okay, so I think I want to pull up some code. And sort of show you what I'm talking about. So this is a library that I wrote. I haven't used it for anything. I might though. It has a purpose, which I'm not going to go into at the moment. But this is the package JSON. So if you look here, a few things are important. The name is important. It's called Redux Connected UI. So unless I namespace it when I publish it, then you would install this by npm install Redux Connected UI. And that whole UMD, Universal Module Definition thing I was talking about, this will, it'll also export like a camel-cased Redux Connected UI global for when it's used in that context. We'll come back to the scripts. So looking at the dependencies, it's got a bunch of dev dependencies, right? I need Babel because React doesn't work in the browser, and if it's not fed through Babel and spit out some browser-friendly code first, right? And then I've got like ESLint just for dev environment stuff, and then Webpack for building and Webpack CLI. Peer dependencies, React, React Redux, and Redux. Oh yeah. So, so in peer dependencies, this is saying that the app consuming this library needs to have React, and it needs to be at least version 16.2. It needs to have React Redux, at least version 5, and Redux at least version 3. And if you have different versions or no versions of those, you'll get those handy warnings when you npm install if you have this as a dependency of your app. Yeah.
If I were to install this, and I'm just getting, kind of the core functionality of it as a user in an application,
yeah.
Do I need all of the dependencies as well?
No.
Okay, so when I install it, does that stuff get installed?
It does not.
Okay.
No. So the dev dependencies, and that happens in the Webpack config, but the dev dependencies aren't bundled with the So you wouldn't get them in your app if you depend on this. You actually, so this library actually doesn't have any dependencies. It has dev dependencies and it has peer dependencies, but it doesn't have any dependencies of its own. So it's not actually adding anything to your app except itself. So it's like super small. It's a few kilobytes, I think, if that. Sometimes, and that is one thing to think about when you author a library, is you don't want to increase the size of people's apps unnecessarily. So the fewer dependencies, the better. Obviously, sometimes you need them, right? Depending on what you're doing, like you don't want to write everything from scratch. That's the whole point of this module system. But don't. But like Lodash is an example of that, and I like Lodash and I use it. But like, if you're writing a library and you need to like map something, don't necessarily like import map from Lodash. Like just use the native one, right? Because it's going to keep your bundle size down, which helps the apps that consume your library. So yeah, so that's the package JSON, and so the peer dependencies. Those have to be there, both so your apps know what they need, but also for your local dev environment. That like your library is not going to work if it doesn't know that those things are supposed to be there somewhere, even though they're not direct dependencies.
Is there a flag that you pass npm install to install that?
I'm going to be honest with you. I just wrote these out. I think.
If you do want to install a dependency, do npm and then dash capital D. And
Yeah,
then
I know for dev dependency, but for peer dependency,
Let's see. I'm going to install peer dependency. -p.
Possibly.
Let's see. Oh, so this is something else. This is talking about installing peer dependencies if they're not found, which is not, that's the opposite of what we're talking about.
So when you build an app library, you just install it regularly and then change it to peer dependency?
Probably, or you have a little example app that consumes it, that has those things in scope. Yeah, I don't know, man. I just wrote them down old school. So that works, but that's probably not the way to do it. I would imagine, right?
Yeah, I was just thinking because wouldn't the dependencies be like, okay, you have your own dependencies for the project, for the library you're building, but how would it know that it's a certain dependency for the next project? Like, is that happening when it's compiling or?
Right. So.
Like, where does the peer dependency?
But that happens in Webpack. Let me show you. I think I know what you're asking. Like, how does your library know that
like, sort
it
of
doesn't?
Building on the last question.
Yeah. So okay. So I think this is what you're talking about. So these are Webpack external dependency definitions. So like. Root is that sort of global var, and then CommonJS and AMD. AMD is like your import React from React type thing. So we're defining these 3 external dependencies, and so this is the Webpack config. This is there's only one, nice and small. Okay, so entry is my source index.js. Output goes to index.js, so that's really easy for NPM to understand. That's the default entry point, right? And then externals is just a config for one of the Webpack config that tells Webpack not to error out when it sees import React from React and there's no dependency on React. So it's going to look for that in the scope of the when this library is bundled with other modules, like in your app, depending on this library, it's going to look for React as an external dependency.
Is that what the universal module looks like? Is this it?
Yeah. So this is how to do the UMD from Webpack. I think Rollup does it automatically, which is why people.
But you manually did this?
Yeah. Yeah. I basically copy pasted this from somebody else's Webpack config from another library. Because I'm sure you could figure this out from reading docs. I bet you could figure this out from reading docs, but I couldn't. So what's that? Yeah, like maybe you could figure this out from reading docs. There's probably a doc somewhere that says how to do this, but I didn't find it. So yeah, but as Webpack configs go, if you work with them, like this isn't too bad. It definitely could be worse. And with Webpack. Recent versions of Webpack 4, you don't have to do a whole bunch of like minify it, uglify it, like it does that stuff for you by default. You actually have to turn off the things that you normally want if you don't want them. So it's pretty straightforward. And then going back to the package JSON, kind of now that we've looked at all of that, the scripts, they're also pretty straightforward. So the build script is just Webpack production mode, dev, build, Webpack, dev mode, like real straightforward. And then pre-publish is the same as the build script. So pre-publish is, I want to build it. And what that enables you to do is not check in your built export, right? So like, there's not really a reason to version control what gets published to NPM, the minified, uglified version of your app, as long as you're version controlling the source code. So like, it's just git ignore is going to ignore that top level index.js, the build file, but it's going to get built every time published so that the latest source goes to NPM. Who's published to NPM? right? So this is also like something that's like, oh, so it's like nothing. You create an account, and then you just like npm publish, and then it asks you to log in, and then it just goes up to npm. There's no vetting process. It's kind of scary. Like you're like, oh yeah, it's like on npm. But no, like your cat could publish a package, a module to npm pretty like by accident. So there's not much to it. The npm docs are good enough. If you just like, if you get hung up, just like npm publish. For me, like putting my first React library up on npm was just challenging to kind of figure out how that all went together. Specifically the peer dependencies, how to bundle it up, and then publishing it. But there's really not like that much to it. And I would definitely, if you have a library or like a React component that you want to make available on npm, I would definitely look at Rollup for that other one. What was that called? Micro bundle. Thank you. Because they're more made for library authoring, where Webpack really shines for apps and like more complex builds. Like,
And Rollup just has a command you run.
yeah, it's like Webpack. It's a CLI thing. I haven't used it, so I don't know exactly how it works. But I think the config is a little more straightforward because it's sort of made to do this. Whereas Webpack, it's just one of the many things that it can do. Yeah, I think that's really it as far as that goes. Kind of my main, thesis, if I had to give one, is just that there's not too much to it, and like, try open sourcing your stuff because it hopefully will save you time in the long run. I kind of like kidded around about a bunch of the stuff I wasted time on, but I do have a couple of nothing React specific, but I have a couple little JavaScript things on npm that I install in apps I work on usually, and it saves me a few minutes of remembering how to do a thing. So it's cool. And then, yeah.
Is there any way to see like how many projects like rely on your project?
Yes. Yeah. GitHub has a whole thing, or is it GitHub?
npm has a downloads number. So for every
yes.
install,
Yeah. npm. Yeah. npm. So this is my my grand npm user. Let's see. I think this one actually is in use. Right. So it shows you your weekly downloads. To be honest with you guys, I think this is one app that uses the thing and just gets built like 3 times a day. But, but it looks like some activity, right? GitHub also has a thing that can show where you can look at even repos you didn't author. You can look at how many other repos. It's GitHub specific, but it'll show you how many repos on GitHub depend on a repo on GitHub. So like React is like whatever, like 100,000, tens of thousands, whatever. Your thing has 0. It's like that's. I'm trying to remember. I had to post a link to that. Let me see. Is it Insights? Nobody knows. Dependency. Okay, yeah, there we go. So, right. So this.
Dependence on the tab.
Yeah. So these are dependencies, and then dependence shows. Yeah. So as far as open source stuff goes, I have one example app that uses this thing. The thing doing all those downloads is not open source. And then these are all the dependencies of this thing. But yeah, if you want to, but you can like go to the React repo and look at the dependence. It's under the Insights tab on GitHub. This and that sort of thing. But npm does have the direct like download information too, which will show you, if there are a lot of closed source or non-GitHub sourced consumers, it'll show you more of that. Anybody else? Questions? Okay, let's do this context thing. Yeah, it hasn't been too long. So, context. Context is cool. Context is not new. Context has been around since React was. It's been around since I started using React for sure. What's new about context is that it is a public documented API. It was an unsafe, don't use, pretend this doesn't exist API up until I think the most recent version of React, or close to that, 16.3, I believe. So like if you've used React Redux, React Redux Connect is a thin wrapper around the context API, basically. So who's used React Redux? Okay, enough people that it's worth mentioning. So with React Redux, it exports a provider component, which you put probably at the top of your tree or at the top of wherever your React tree needs to know about your Redux store. What that provider component does is it taps into the context API and it makes the store and the dispatch method available to anything below it via React context. And then your consumers of the context are, you do that through React Redux generally with the connect export. So you like connect the component and you tell it how to map state to props, and you have your dispatch functions if you need them. And so what it's doing is it's grabbing the store from the context, it's taking your functions, applying it to the store, and then feeding it to the wrapped component as props. So that's all context is. What's great now is that we can use it and it's documented, and it's not going to be like, oh, well, it broke. Sorry, we told you it wasn't supported. So, you know, whatever. We getting kicked out, Lewis? Oh, not enough movement. Hey. Well, whatever. It's nice and setting the mood, creating the context. Yeah. Okay. So now context has this public API, and it's got this really like buttery render prop API, which is pretty cool. If you haven't worked with it, it's nice. So I don't have slides or anything, but I just did an example in Code Sandbox of how to use context. So React now has this export called create context. And if you just search like React context, there's a whole section in Docs about it. So you just call create context, and so this to me is a little misleading. You give it sort of an initial state, but this initial state that you pass here doesn't actually get used by the app unless a context provider isn't in the tree where a consumer is. So basically, unless you mess up or something, I don't know why you would ever want to do that unless you just had static context, in which what's the point of using it anyways. So this is sort of, you give it this default value, but like you wouldn't really use it. So basically you just have to create a context, and that context will give you, look at that in a second. Right, so we call create context, give it an initial value, which doesn't really mean anything, keep that in mind. And now we have this theme context, which is just the instantiated or invoked create context. So I have this class theme provider, and it's going to, it's like your React Redux provider component. So, so I've got my theme context, I'm importing that from where we just defined it here. Yep. That better? Okay. So we've got theme context. And so with your provider of context, what it needs to have is a value. And that value is going to be fed to consumer components anywhere in the tree below the provider. And that'll make more sense probably when we show it. But basically, whatever you want your consuming components to know about, you have to put in the value. And that's how they get access to it. So that's sort of a magic prop of the theme context provider that you need to supply. So in this instance, what I'm doing with context is I'm setting a theme, which is going to change the color of something. It's not a very pretty one, but it's just a contrived example. So So it has two things in our value. A theme is going to render its children so that you can just put this in the tree wherever you want it, and then you don't have to worry about like it's easy to move around and whatnot because it's just going to wrap whatever you put it around. So it's the provider. Any questions about the provider? Yeah.
Can you access the provider outside of the render function? Like
What do you mean access the provider?
Well, I'm just thinking like if you wanted to, let's say, do some kind of Axios request or an API request, and then you get some data and you want to pass it to the provider, like would you have to put it into state, or can you just stick it right to the provider from like on that call?
So you could do, so if this required some sort of network request, we could have like, say we had like user in our theme, right? We could totally do like a component did mount, you know, Ajax, get user, you know, and then set state. So
do you have to put it into state, or do you have to put it in the provider state, or can you just pass it right in?
you can get it from anywhere. So it doesn't matter if this comes from state or like you import it from some static file, or you get it from a, you know, from an Ajax call.
Well, actually, I think we could do something inside of that. So, like basically, what provider is this element that is basically like a magic thing where you create it and then you just use it. You put in your tree. Then everything below it is essentially getting a invisible prompt, so it's delivered to it all the way down. And the way you access it, you use the other side of the it's kind of tuned into the radio frequency of the provider, and then so receive it. So now when the provider receives prompts, it's forwarding those prompts down. So as you know, your React is just slowly turning away, rendering down. The consumers are essentially getting that prompt teleported to them instead of, you know, how some people will do prompt and then go down again. That's what's
right. It lets you avoid prop drilling. Was that your question though, or is it more about the mechanics of the provider?
To kind of get what you're saying, that you can pass in pretty much anything to the provider. I was just wondering if you had a way to access the provider outside of the render. Like if you could just say like provider.name is equal to
If it has like methods, no. No, you did, but you could. I mean, you can basically do anything with this. So like, to Victor's point, like if we had this theme provider accept props, like it could provide value based on props it received as well. Like the value can come from anywhere. You just have to have it in the scope of the provider component so that you can pass it to this value prop, which again is, you know, there's a bit of like magic, like value is sort of like children. It's like a magic React prop that does a certain thing. You couldn't name it something else and have it work. And so Gabe's point is, I think that like the whole sort of great thing about context is that it lets you avoid prop drilling. So if we needed this theme here and here in our component tree, we don't have to pass it down all the way and change it every time we want to change something about this value. All we have to do is change the consumers and the provider. So so that's the theme provider. I don't know what I changed here, but I'll just save it, hope for the best. So if I go to my app, you see I just wrapped everything in the theme provider. So anything in the app has access to that theme provider value with a context consumer. So that's the next thing we'll look at. Header, right? So I've got two consumers in this app. So this is what the app looks like. It's basically the Code Sandbox Hello World slightly modified. So I've got this button that toggles the light and dark theme, and then I've got this header that receives the light and dark theme. So it's like, it's pretty fancy stuff. I know you're impressed, but yeah. So we've got so we've got two consumers, and this is where the whole render prop thing comes in. For familiar with render props as a thing? Okay, so render props are sort of an alternative to higher order components. We could have a really long discussion about render props and whether they're awesome or not. There's a video by Michael Jackson, who's one of the co-authors of React Router, about why render props are great. So I would encourage you to watch that if you're interested in this topic. But basically what a render prop is it's a component that accepts a function to render instead of a tree of React elements like a normal component. So like, normally you write something like div, whatever, thing, nested thing, right? Nexted thing, and that sort of thing. A render prop, so if thing had a render prop API instead of sort of a standard React API, it would pass an argument or arguments to a function that it receives, which would then render according to them. So, and that's what this theme context consumer does. I'm just kind of trying to explain it in more abstract terms. So like, so we would give it something like this. So like we needed to know whether to render a div or a link tag based on some Boolean thing. This thing component would expect a function that receives this single Boolean argument and then returns the JSX or the React elements instead of just directly nesting them. So it takes a little getting used to as far as the syntax goes, but it's a cool way to add functionality in a sort of abstract way that doesn't affect your UI directly. So what theme context does, that consumer does, is it expects a render prop function that receives the provider value as its argument. So remember, the provider has a value of an object with two keys, theme and toggle theme. So any theme context dot consumer component is going to pass the function it receives as a child that value. So here we only need the theme, we don't need the toggle theme. And then I'm going to set the class name directly to either dark or light, depending on whatever the theme is set to at the time. So that's one consumer. And then the other consumer is toggle theme, which is that little button at the bottom there. So this is another theme context consumer, and it's going to need both of those keys, right? Theme and toggle theme. So on click, it's going to toggle theme, and then it's going to, the text is going to be the opposite of whatever the current theme is. So yeah, it's like UI 202. Like this is how you create an excellent user experience right here. But no, I jest. But yeah. So does the render prop thing make sense? Okay, cool. Yeah. To me, it took a little getting used to. I was like, HOCs, rock, render props suck. But now that I've gotten used to it,
that's the render prop.
Yeah, so this is like a typical render prop API where instead of theme context consumer expecting just nested like JSX or React elements, it expects a function that accepts like a certain argument that the parent component defines and then returns that UI. Yeah.
To be clear, you're structuring on the prop provided or the value of the provided?
So this isn't a prop. This is the argument that's passed to the function of whatever the children of this theme context consumer are. So it's not a prop. Well, so theme provider, the value is going to be whatever the current state is for theme, and toggle theme is just this function that's going to toggle it. So Just get rid of that. So like, you know, this, I probably should have done this earlier. So if we look at the component tree here, so theme provider renders the context provider, right? The theme context provider, and it shows up in this special color and everything in your React tree, which is pretty cool. And so it's got the current value, and then that doesn't do anything that you can see. It just makes it available to any consumers below it, right? But we can't really like see that. And we don't have to, the great thing is we don't have to pass it down to the header and to the toggle theme and whatever. So toggle theme renders a context consumer. And in your React tree, you don't see the whole render prop thing. You just see what's returned from that function, which is that button. And so it has this toggle theme method from the context provider, and it has the value of the current value of the theme. And if we, yeah, so it just.
How many providers do you have in the project?
You can have as many providers as you need. So you don't
want to have one.
Well, you don't have to use one. You could use one provider. I don't know like performance implications of using multiple versus one provider, but I mean, it's pretty new, you know. I think whatever you want to do.
What was the question?
How many providers can you have? Yeah, I think if you need a user provider and a theme provider and a whatever provider, you know, you can use it. Whatever provider you need. And you don't have to wrap your entire app in the context provider. You only need to have it high enough that the components that need that context can get at it, right? So if we had just a little section of the app that was like big in itself, but not at the top, we wouldn't have to put this provider way at the top of the tree at like app.js, right? It can just feed that certain section of the app that needs it. Sure, yeah. Header also renders a context consumer. And again, in the rendered React tree, the whole render prop thing doesn't exist, right? Like you can't see it because it just renders what you return from that function. So I guess that's a little bit harder to follow in some ways than how you would look at higher order components in a React tree, but there's trade-offs to both.
How did you get that React toolkit?
The dev tools?
Yeah.
It's just the dev tools?
I've seen that before.
Oh man, seriously?
Yeah.
React dev tools, man.
I mean, I used the standalone thing, but I didn't know there was like in.
Oh yeah, Chrome Web Store. This is like the first thing I do when I open a computer. I'm like, it's like this Redux dev tools and like JSON formatter. Boom, done.
Yeah, like being able to see what sites.
Question was whether it's available in Firefox. I wouldn't know.
Yeah, I always used a standalone, but like it was kind of clunky, so I didn't really like use it religiously. But this would like change my life.
Oh man, yeah. Wow, that was worth the price of admission for sure. Man. You really want to do that.
You know, like Matt the other day, like you were the last time that had like iTerm, it was like iTerm was the truth.
So yeah, context. So one question people ask about context is, you know, is it a replacement for Redux? And I think the short answer to that is no. Like Redux gives you a lot more. Part of Redux is the context. Really, that's like React Redux. Like I said, React Redux is a wrapper around the React Context API. But what it's giving you is your store, which you would, if you wanted to replace Redux with context, you just have to re-implement Redux, right? But you just have a different way of providing it to your components. So I think definitely not. But if you're only using Redux to avoid prop drilling, then maybe it can replace Redux in your app, if that makes sense. So
maybe a smaller app.
Yeah, if you're using Redux all the time just because you feel like you need it because you don't want to pass props around, like context can definitely solve that problem for you. but it doesn't give you an immutable store with actions that you can time travel through and stuff. So that's all the stuff that Redux does that context is not going to do.
It's like a changes.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So this is kind of a single purpose thing that they call exporters as a way to popular.
I mean, I suppose so. Yeah. Like, there's not like the benefit of it is that you avoid prop drilling, but I mean that's a serious problem in a big app, right? Like if your component tree is like 100 components, then drilling props is a huge maintenance issue. So.
And also, like you said, it keeps people from reaching for enough, whereas we just overcomplicate shit out.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's one of the issues that people have had with Redux all along is that it's been used as a context provider where you didn't actually need like the whole state management thing. I don't know. I mean, I definitely like I'm not anti-Redux at all, but I started to see the arguments that it's overused.
Well, I mean, like the context app used to be like totally hell on earth. Like it was
Right.
really buggy, really weird, really specific.
Changed all the time.
And Redux, I mean, really what Redux and MobX did was like make it like user friendly in a sense, where now they released like a proper version that's like officially supported. It works, it's stable, doesn't like mess with your head or anything. So,
And it's green. Look at this. It's green. It's special.
So you're saying you should probably just start with context, and then once you need Redux.
I'm not saying anything. So the question was, I'm trying to repeat the questions if anybody's actually streaming, which I doubt at this point. But the question was, would you want to start with context and then use Redux if you need to? I mean, like, I don't want to get into that issue, but if all you need is to get up a certain like value in a bunch of different places, then context will do that for you.
Why not start out contacts
Uh-huh.
and then add Redux into it?
You should do that.
That's what I'm getting at. So all contacts.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we can get simpler contacts.
You should do that or start with Redux.
the thing is that you create context provider pairs as pairs, right? And so you're probably going to do that somewhere in like an abstract, like a little library you make for yourself, some like higher order import where, because like the thing is that you're not going to access the value of that provider unless you render, you put a render function in the receiver. Is that how that works?
The consumer, yeah.
The consumer has to have a render function. So most of the time, for you to have any like decent experience with it, you're gonna have to just wrap it like 3 times with whatever logic you have. So it's really not plug and play. It looks plug and play, but it's really not. And
it depends on how you want to use it. Like you can just plug it in and use it like this, if you're comfortable with that.
I mean, I guess
It's also worth noting that everybody didn't mention this is specific to 16.3.
16.3,
So
yeah.
if you're working in an open locus, you're using
All right, no more questions about Redux. Yes, sir.
I feel like one good way to use it right away is you could just have your context provider at the top, have your single window event listener, and your mouse move event listener, and then feed the coordinates and your window size down to anything that needs it throughout the whole app.
Uh-huh.
So you can just have one event listener that
I would-
provides like the source of truth for your whole.
I'd be interested to see like what the actual performance of that was, but that's
Probably
it.
better than doing a separate listener.
Right. Every time you need it, yeah.
that make a good library.
Yeah, open source that. Any other questions? All right, do we have anything else, Matt? There's chicken left.
Oh, actually, we do have something. This is,
Oh.
yeah, I should have mentioned this at the beginning.
Come on up, man.
So, yeah, thanks so much. So, Facebook is doing a hackathon. It's called Developer Circles, I think is what it's called. Have any of you guys heard about this? Yeah, okay, cool. So, you can correct me if I missed some stuff or whatever. But they're doing a hackathon. Basically, the idea is it's a theme around like bringing people together. Right? That's what Facebook's about. Maybe they're just trying to like I don't know. Community. Yeah, you see where I'm going with this. I'm trying to appease the developer community after fucking up, maybe. So we're doing this hackathon. Oh yeah, we're sure. Just kidding, guys. Yeah, Facebook like heard that. I'm never gonna get.
They just canceled.
Yeah, they just like
Orlando. They're not.
they're not. Yeah. But it's a neat idea. So the theme is bringing people together. They want apps around that theme, and they want you to use any kind of Facebook open source tag. So could be React, could be GraphQL, whatever. And we actually want to try and partner with the backend developers meetup and the Orlando JS meetup to get like a kind of like a free meetup group thing to build something out. So we kind of want to do like a hack night around that hackathon. And there are prizes, like there's like cash prizes for different regions, and then there's like I think it's like $30,000 or something insane for global.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So they're putting some money on it. And then there's like I said, there are also regional prizes. And so does that seem like interesting to people? Does that seem like something? Okay, we got a couple of.
We're hoping to do it when we would normally do the meetup.
Right. So
like today, next month.
That's a good
All
question.
night, man.
Yeah, I mean,
All day.
that's Red Bulls. I mean, that's like he's joking, but like maybe
we could get all the Red Bull you can drink if that would be an incentive. We could definitely make that happen.
Yeah, I mean, what do you guys think? I mean, are you guys trying to do like an all night kind of thing? Or I was even thinking like if we wanted to go crazy, like they do these startup weekend things, so it'd be like a multi-day thing or whatever. Well, nah, that's hardcore.
It probably wouldn't be here.
I think we need to come up with an idea before we start.
But like, what do they want you to make? Like an app or a?
Well, so the way that this would be structured, the way that I'm envisioning it, and this is the way that startup weekend works, is like you send out information about the general theme, and then like at the beginning of the night, like everybody's gonna pitch their ideas, and then teams form around those ideas. Basically.
Gotcha.
So we're not all gonna be on the same team. There's gonna be kind of teams forming around different ideas.
It's gonna crush you.
And then we just kind of go from there. And hopefully we'll have some backend guys from backend development to do like some stuff. Or Song over here who does backend development, so maybe he can help us out. So yeah, so wait, all right. So raise your hand if that seems like something you would be interested in. Okay, shit. Yeah, that's good. I think that's worth
At
doing.
least half of them are telling the truth. So
Yeah. So I think that
should work out.
Yeah,
The submission deadline's in July. Right?
Yeah, it's at the end of July.
Yeah.
So we get ideas.
We could absolutely, if you're eager,
I'm trying to win this thing.
Yeah, if you.
Yeah, this guy.
So why don't we put the link to the thing,
Yes.
to the Facebook thing in the Slack channel?
Yes.
And if anybody wants to start working on something before that day, definitely do that. If you can, I mean, if we're forming our own ideas and somebody comes with a half-baked done
So
idea,
it's around
get
people getting together.
Yeah, connecting.
connecting people.
But the thing
Yeah,
is,
here, can you pull it up? Because I think it's kind of vague. Yeah. It's
Kumbaya.
I think it's
What's it called?
Developer Circles Facebook Hackathon. That seems. Yeah.
specific.
I mean, the one guy
There it is, the guy
who's
who's
isn't here tonight, but the young buddy.
All right. So up to $30,000 in prizes. That's suspicious. Okay.
Here's the challenge website right here. That might actually give some examples.
Okay, so how to enter, register, Matt will do all this stuff. Facebook.
Yeah, I'll take care of it. No,
we just signed you up.
totally.
Okay, so what are we actually doing? Build solutions and give people the power to build community, bring the world, and probably whatever we build, Facebook will own it, right? So keep that in mind. Don't bring your next startup idea, I would think, right?
I don't know.
It's just something to do. Yeah, so, okay. You might decide to craft an awesome messenger experience. Yeah, so it sounds like we
So you have to use Facebook.
Well, no, you only have to use a Facebook developer product, as in React, GraphQL, one of their libraries or whatever.
Okay.
But I guess they're just sort of, putting this idea out here that like maybe you want to help us make Messenger better, or whatever. So, right for
This is for their next idea.
Not
I mean,
me,
that's
because I've already
basically.
trashed
I mean,
out.
that's pretty much any hackathon, though, right? Like there is a bit of
Yeah, they're gonna
you're
do
doing work for somebody for free, basically. But that's
Well,
just kind of what happens.
Yeah, something like that.
So how long does it span? Like, do you have to, once you come up with an idea, submit it, and then you have to-
So you submitted, you're wondering like how long it takes for them to judge your idea? Is that what you're asking?
Right, and like, when's the due date for all submissions?
The due date, I think, is July 26th.
It should say on here. Let's
Yeah.
see. So yeah, the idea is we would hack at it that day, and then July 26th. So you could, it's already started, and then so we meet the third Thursday. We probably have a week or two.
We could make it. We
could do it earlier. That's true. Yeah.
If that's what you.
I think you definitely need to toss some ideas around first.
Yeah. Well, maybe what we can do is, can we do like a group? We can do a group message in the meetup group, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we can start a thread.
Who's not on Orlando Dev Slack? Anybody not on it? All right. So join the React JS, or
We should probably just make a channel for it.
We'll make a channel and we'll post it in the React channel.
Yeah.
Definitely not the PHP.
These are all the Facebook developer tools. So it includes the open source, which we're familiar with, like React and stuff. But also like AR, some of the stuff I don't even know what it is. But if you use any of this in your project,
We could make
makes
a
it eligible.
camera filter that puts like a lot of friends in your pic. So
Yeah,
it's like
chipmunk
and
face.
it's like bringing you together.
Yeah, got it.
You know, sort of.
What if we create some kind of like social network, a marketplace, people have groups, post a status update.
I like it.
That's a good idea.
Revolutionary. Make different.
But maybe we just make it so you can only put out a little bit of text, right? Like about 160 characters.
All right, so we'll continue this conversation on Slack. But that's probably what we'll be doing next month. Is that hacking on things?
If anyone needs some skills, HTML.
All right, cool. I'm gonna end the stream here.
That sounds pretty interesting.
All right, now we can talk shit about things.
Yes. I use Google Plus.